In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front lower control arm with the ball joint on this Ford F-150. Let's get started. To begin, let's take off the wheel. On this model, we have a center cap that covers up the lug nuts. If you don't have one, just directly use your 21mm socket and take off the lug nuts. But for us, we have to pry this off. They make a little notch in the wheel where you can remove the center cap. And this will expose the 6 21mm lug nuts. And just like I mentioned earlier, remove all of them, and then we can take off the wheel. Let's start by removing this cap that hides the fastener for the axle. Sometimes you can get it with some large pliers. If not, we'll have to tap it out of here. A lot of times they get stuck, seized, and they don't want to come out. But yeah, looks like I'll have to hammer it. That's fine. I'm going to grab a chisel. You could get a pry bar or anything that you have that's small enough to fit in that lip there, and just tap it till it breaks free. Try not to damage it too much. It does bend easily. Okay, now let's grab the pliers, work it back and forth until you can remove it. There we go, 13mm axle nut. Now from the back side, unplug the vacuum supply lines for the locking hub. Just work it back and forth, that should pop off. Then we have to separate the ABS wire from the harness here because the ABS wire will come down, whereas the vacuum and the brake hose will stay with the vehicle. Now from the back side, remove the two 18mm bolts that hold the caliper with the bracket onto the knuckle. Okay, once you have the first one out, just put it right back in a couple threads so it can hold the caliper while you remove the other one. Take off the lower bolt, pull the caliper aside. The vacuum hose will come with it, and I have a bungee cord right here so I can secure it without putting any pressure on the brake hose. Remove the rotor. If it's seized on there, just hammer in between the lug studs to break it free. Let's remove the lower nut for the sway bar link, 18mm socket. Okay, the whole thing is spinning, so I'm just going to hold it up top with some pliers. There we go. And now you're going to want to do the same to the other side before we move up to the top. And I'll show you why right now. Next, we have to remove the tie rod. So with a 21mm socket, take this nut off. Leave it on a few threads so that when you break this free, the tie rod doesn't go flying down. Take a hammer and just hit the knuckle right here. That should break this tie rod stud free. Now you can take the nut off, set it aside. I actually like to put it right back on the tie rod, that way I don't accidentally misplace it. And you can bungee cord this to the side or just let it hang like this. Next we have to remove the upper ball joint nut, 21mm socket. Get it on here, most likely you'll need a swivel. Once you have this loose, leave this one on a couple threads so that once again we can break this free without the knuckle falling down. Take your hammer and hammer the knuckle right here. There we go. Pry this down, remove the nut, and let this swing up. As the knuckle swings forward, push the axle through, just like this. At this point, you will be able to remove this axle from the knuckle, and you can just leave it right here. Now we have to take the knuckle off of the lower ball joint. This is a 24mm nut, so let's remove it. Keep in mind, there's nothing else holding this knuckle on, so just be careful. It's probably gonna be stuck on the stud here, but like I said, be careful. Once this is off, put it back on a few threads. just like this, so that when we hammer the knuckle, it doesn't fall to the ground. It can be caught by the nut. I'm going to go from the back side because I want to hammer right here. Turn the knuckle as much as you can and hammer this area on the back side. Okay, now get your socket back on here because most likely the nut is going to be a little stuck. Hold on to the knuckle, remove the nut. And pull the knuckle down. At this point, I want to loosen up the lower strut bolt, and this is a 27 millimeter headed bolt with a 30 millimeter nut. You'll need a deep socket for this, or a wrench if you have that. Put the wrench over the nut. I'm going to try and break the bolt free for two reasons. If it works, that means I can spin it inside the bushing here, and I can guarantee that it won't be seized, and it'll allow me to just drive it straight out. But if it doesn't work, I'll just reverse it and I'll hold the bolt, loosen the nut, and then try to spin the bolt out. I am not trying to remove the bolt at this point. When I do remove it, I'm going to put a support underneath the lower control arm because otherwise it'll want to swing down. For now, I just want to break it free. Here we go. Okay, so that worked. There's the nut. I'm going to set it aside, but like I said, I am not removing the bolt from the strut, because what we have to do now is loosen up the control arm to frame bolts. And that's this one right here in the front, similar one looking in the back. Just like with the strut bolt, I just want to loosen it. I don't want to remove it at this point. Hold the nut side with a 27, put a 21 on the bolt side, and again, just like with the strut, if you can't do it this way, just reverse your sockets and use the air gun on the nut side. Okay. On the back side, we have to hold the nut with a wrench because the sway bar bracket is right here. And we'll take the bolt out with the same 21 millimeter socket. This time you'll need a swivel though. If you cannot find a 27 millimeter wrench, you can use a 1 1/16, which is what I'm using. Might be a little easier to find that. I'm just gonna try and break this free. You can put a piece of pipe on your wrench, and if you break free the nut, that usually relieves tension off of the bolt because the swivel removes some of the torque from the impact. So now let's try again, and it should work. Okay, it's loose, it's spinning, it's not seized in there. Perfect. I'm going to put my pull jack under here, put some pressure on this control arm so I can remove this bolt safely without it swinging down. Sometimes you actually don't even need to put pressure on it, you just need to very lightly support it. Pull this out, okay? Leave it just like this. You're not going to go very far with it because now we need to take the bolts out of the control arm where they go into the frame. I'm going to leave this supported here, push these bolts through. There's one. I get this other one out. This one's proving to be a little more difficult, so I'm going to take pry bar and just tap it out. You can keep going with the hammer and the pry bar, but I'm going to punch it out with the air chisel. There it is. Okay. And there you have it. There's the lower control arm with the ball joint. Grab the new control arm and try to line it up. You can either put it into the shock first or the frame. I'm just going to opt for putting it right into the frame. If your bolts are rusty, I recommend cleaning the rust up and putting anti-seize on the shaft of the bolt so that it doesn't seize in the control arm in the future. Avoid putting it on the end of the threads because that's where the nut clamps on and you want it to stay nice and tight. If they are rotted, replace them. Make sure they're good quality bolts. I recommend getting them from the manufacturer directly. Now, because the rear bolt has to slide in at a very slight angle here, we're going to start with that one. And I find that that is a lot easier to get the control arm lined up that way. So once it lines up with the mounting hole in the frame, slide this bolt in, at least just enough to hold it in place. Oh, or, all the way through. I guess if that happens, that's even better. try to line up the front bolt now. This one went in rear to front. Now as you bring in the lower strut to line it up, make sure the sway bar link goes through also. Slide this bolt through, just like that. Put the mounting nuts onto everything. This strut right here, which the torque for this is 351 foot-pounds. And the two control arm bushings, the torque for these is 258. Before we torque this, however, I need to raise the suspension up at right height or approximately at right height. That way the bushings, both here and here, are not in a bind and don't have excessive pressure on them. If that is the case, you will wear out these bushings prematurely and you'll have to do the job all over again. Doesn't have to be perfect, but just approximate right height, which for me is going to be right about here. I do not have a torque wrench that goes up to 351 foot-pounds, so what I'm going to do is just tighten it up with my air gun. That should be pretty tight right there. Now when it comes time to tightening the bushings to the frame, of course you will still need a professional alignment no matter how close you get these, but I try to get them as close as possible, and the way to do that if you didn't mark the frame is most likely there will be witness marks is what they're called, and that's basically just the imprints of where the bolt used to be and the nut as well, so it's actually pretty easy to line it up even if you did not mark it. When you have the control arm jacked up, most likely the bolts are going to want to pull forward. However, you can take a large pry bar, stick it right in between the bolt here and the control arm, go up onto the frame, and you can easily pry this back. This front one should line up pretty close right off the bat. The rear one will be a little more difficult, but still doable. Again, the torque for these is 258 foot-pounds. My torque wrench maxes out at 250, so I'm just going to go for 250. But I, of course, will snug them up with my air gun first to make sure that they do not move. Get it in position. Looking at it, I can see that it's pretty much spot on to where it was, so that's perfect. For this one, I'm going to have to tighten on the bolt side, just like when we removed it. And for this, you actually have a little slot in the frame, so you can easily pry backwards on this. Okay, I was successful at holding the nut and prying at the same time. That lines up also, perfect. I cannot fit a torque wrench here, nor can I fit one here, just because of the axle, it hits it. So it's going to be at an angle, and also torquing the bolt side decreases the efficiency of the torque wrench because you're fighting the friction of the bolt through the bushing and the frame and the nut. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to put a wrench on here, put a piece of pipe over it for leverage, and crank it down this way. I will torque the front one because I can, but 258 foot-pounds just means very tight, basically. It's going to be difficult to over-tighten this one, actually. Okay, you do need an alignment, like I said, so these will most likely be loosened up again by your alignment professional anyway. And 258 foot-pounds for this front bushing, which is a lot easier to torque because you have a lot more room. And that's it right there. Now you can take pressure off of your suspension. Grab the knuckle, slide it up and over the lower ball joint. Start the nut on to make sure that it's secured on here. Okay, now you can let go of it. Let's snug this up. 111 foot-pounds is the torque for this mounting nut. That's it right there. Now pull the knuckle forward, push the axle back, and try to get it into its spot. Okay, just like that. There we go. Push the knuckle up, line up the ball joint stud at the top, press it through the best you can, and quickly start the nut on so it stays. It's going to be quite a bit of pressure on these bushings. Snug this up, 21mm socket. If this is happening to you where the whole stud is spinning, let me show you a trick. Grab a good sized pry bar so you can have some leverage. Pry down on the stud, up against the spring. And, well, I should have used a deep socket, but you get the point. It actually holds the stud in place. 111 foot-pounds is the torque for this nut. I'm going to take out the pry bar because I shouldn't need it at this point. If you do, well, keep it in there and pry down on it. That's it right there. This is a locking nut, so no cotter pin required. Let's get the tie rod reconnected, slide it through, put the mounting nut back on, let's bottom it out, and torque it to 85 foot-pounds. The knuckle's going to want to spin on you, but that's fine. It'll still get torqued, especially once it bottoms out the other way. Put the axle nut on, we'll tighten it up and torque it to 25 foot-pounds. 25 foot-pounds is not a lot, so I'm just going to go until it stops spinning, not any more than that. Just like that. And to torque it, I'm just going to hold the hub with my hand because it's not that tight. If for some reason you can't hold it because it's putting too much pressure on it, just hold it with a pry bar in between the lug studs. Perfect. Don't forget to put this little cap back on to seal everything up here. I actually like to put a little bit of grease on this lip here. This will not only allow the cap to slide on a lot easier, but it will seal it up. If you want to use some gasket maker, you can use that. I recommend using a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer. That way you don't damage this surface even more than it might have already gotten damaged. A couple of hits should do it. Make sure it's nice and flush all around. If you have any excess grease, just wipe it off so it doesn't fling all over the place once you start driving. I have a new hub here, but if you still had your old one, you would want to sand it down so that it's nice and clean, mostly on these two ridges here, the outer one and the inner one, not so much in the middle, that doesn't really matter. And then you want to do the same thing on the rotor where it mounts, because you don't want any raised areas to be in between the hub and the rotor. That'll make the rotor sit at an angle, and that's not great. That'll result in some braking issues. Apply some anti-seize to the whole surface of the hub. Focus on this inner lip here, the inner ring, as well as the outer one. I recommend putting some in the center as well, just so that doesn't rust. But the most important areas are this outer ring and this inner one right here. That's where the rotor actually touches and is most likely to seize. Put a thin layer on. You don't need a lot, otherwise it'll start flinging onto the rotor as you drive at higher speeds. I cleaned up the inside of the rotor to make sure that it has no rust buildup. Flip it over and install it on the hub. In order to hold the rotor here, I'm just going to put a lug nut on and bottom it out by hand to hold it nice and flush for me. Now take the caliper, slide it over the rotor. If the pads don't fit anymore, it's probably because they moved around, so just pry them out. There we go. Line up the bolt holes, slide in the mounting bolts and start them by hand. And 2. Since I'm here, I'm going to plug in this vacuum line. That way it's done and I don't have to think about it anymore. This also gets it out of my way for when I torque the caliper bolts. And speaking of caliper bolts, these two get torqued to 148 foot-pounds. That's 1. And 2. Make sure you re-secure the ABS wire. Now put the bottom sway bar link nut on and tighten it up. The torque for this is 66 foot-pounds. There we go. Now let's get the wheels back on, put back all 6 of your lug nuts, and torque them all down in a cross pattern to 150 foot-pounds. Double check them. And if you have one of these lug nut covers, go ahead and put it back on. Now you can take it for a road test, and don't forget to get an alignment.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.